Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Tech UK's Digital Ethics Summit. My name is Sue Daly. I'm Director of Technology and Innovation here at Tech UK, and I'm going to be your guide for what is going to be an amazing jam-packed afternoon of keynotes and panels and discussions. I mean, what we have for you is just amazing. So welcome back. If you're new to us as well, hello. Quick thank you to everybody involved in the summit, particularly our sponsors, so our headline sponsor Sage, our knowledge partner Quantum Black, and our breakout session sponsors, Software Stereo, Twitter, and Clifford Chance. More from them as we go. I think we've had an amazing morning, and I'm not even going to try and recap them all the sessions that we had, because let's focus on what's coming up this afternoon. So this afternoon, we have, working backwards, we're going to end the day with a fascinating panel on what does fiction tell us about our hopes and fears for future technology, chaired by Tava Podolsub, with some amazing writers, including Ted Chang and Kevin McLeod. And then before then, we've got a session that I'll be chairing of looking to the future and can technology be a trustworthy agent of positive change? Really looking forward to that discussion. Before then, we have a keynote on the tech industry and climate change from Sasha Lucino at Hugging Face, looking at do we have to slow down development to slow down emissions? So focusing on that climate change discussion that came up before this morning. Before then, we have a panel session in the plenary on regulation, assurance, and auditing, and what role will different approaches to governance play in the future of trustworthy AI, with speakers such as Felicity Birch from the CDEI, Professor Luciano Floridi, who many of you all know from the summits before, Sana Kurigani from the head of the Office for AI, Liz Grenham from Quantum Black, and chaired by Andrew Strait from Ada Lovelace Institute. So that's going to be a cracking panel. You don't want to miss that. And then we have panel sessions looking at a free and open internet, looking at the technology and the future work, and also a panel on mutant algorithms, the perfect political scapegoat, ? So a lot coming up this afternoon, which you'll be able to hopefully join us and stay with us. But we're kicking off the afternoon first with the opening plenary session of this afternoon. We're looking at equipping police forces to use tech ethically, a really important and timely discussion, which is going to be chaired by Giles Hairdale. But before we get there, we're really excited to have some opening remarks to help us kick off this really important discussion from Professor Fraser Sampson, the UK's Biometric and Surveillance Camera Commissioner. Now, Professor Sampson is going to provide us some opening remarks from his perspective on this topic. Before then, we lead into the panel discussion. Before I hand over to Professor Sampson, who I know is with us, just to say, we're continuing to live tweet this afternoon using the hashtag digital ethics. The Q&A function will be open as well throughout the afternoon. So please do add your questions in there. Be part of the discussion. We've already seen so much this afternoon, this morning already on Twitter, but we want to, hear from you. If you're at the summit and you're enjoying, get involved in the conversation. But with that, I think, Professor Sampson, it was a real pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you so much for being part of the Digital Ethics Summit. And the floor is yours for your opening remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks to Tech UK for the invitation to this event. Look, how do we equip the police to use technology ethically? The first challenge here is, of course, what we mean by the ethical use of technology. Many within Tech UK will know of my ongoing exchanges with a foreign-owned surveillance company in this area. But let's move the discussion away from there and consider another topical setting. Is the use of surveillance technology to bug the embassy of another country and secretly listen to their proceedings ethical? And what if that surveillance provided the only independent evidence of an assassination of a journalist, without which we would never know what had befallen them? Now, I don't want to get into another row with another powerful country, but the scenario reveals just how blurred this discussion can become. So bring it back home for a moment and bring the question back home. How do we equip our police to use technology ethically? And when I was considering this on receiving your invitation, it occurred to me that would it sound odd if we were to ask that same question about our other public services? So how we equip doctors to use technology ethically, or teachers, or how about our firefighters? Then the good news is that our police are already equipped to use technology ethically. In terms of policy and law, they have legal obligations to behave ethically and have given a corporate professional undertaking to do so, having a national code of ethics which sits at the heart of the national decision-making model. And there are other elements of the legislative framework within which they operate that underscore this, things such as data protection regime, European Convention on Human Rights, prevention of torture, and so forth. Our police also have lots of experience in the ethical use of technology. If we go back a few years, we can see how our police ethically adopted breathalyzers, rigid handcuffs, incapacitant spray. Taser is a good and obvious example. It was introduced in 2003. Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights gives citizens an absolute right not to be tortured or treated inhumanely by the state. So police officers applying electrical current deliberately to their body certainly is capable of amounting to that. Article 3 is plainly engaged by the use of taser, and we know that from the jurisprudence in Strasbourg. But we haven't, to my knowledge, had any Article 3 challenges as a result of unethical use of taser in this way by our police. On the other hand, you may have heard the data protection expression about using technology that says, just because we can doesn't mean we should. Well, in some policing cases that engage Article 3, yes, it does, not just morally, but legally. So it ought to go without saying then that the police will use technology ethically. But the question is so commonly asked now, it probably reflects something of a recent development in modern policing. Yes, criminologists tell us that the relationship between the police and the public will always be ambivalent because of their obligations to investigate. But when it comes to new technology, I wonder, is there something else going on? One possibility is the speed of adoption of new technology by the police and how far this has allowed for proper and meaningful public consultation and explanation in advance of deployment. At the same time, there has been a change in public awareness of technology in policing, particularly in the area of biometric surveillance. The police's audience is now much more attentive. These two features, I believe, the increased speed of deployment and heightened public sensitivity, are inextricably linked. Another possibility for this development is the way in which some new technology has been introduced. Now, some live facial recognition exponents will claim that you can only do reliable trials in live settings. But if we had tested taser for the first time in live conditions on the population at large to get the voltage right, we may have had a different outcome. And then there's the technology and the technological capability itself. If, like the police, you have a duty to investigate, then the more you can do with your technology, the more important it will be to show what you're not doing with it. Proving a negative, as we know, is notoriously difficult already, but the lack of ethical use will equal an erosion of trust, which means that when you try to provide negative assurance, no one's buying it. And things are changing fast. If you drive a car less than 5 years old, it will probably contain the technological capability to prove whether you were speeding at any point. But the police haven't so far used that technological capability to prosecute speeders, even though to do so might save lives. Now, will the same be true when we're all driving electric vehicles? When we add in AI, machine learning, automated decision-making, and so on, the continuum for potential misuse lengthens towards infinity. And in this setting, maybe ethics should be seen like the number 0, as described by mathematician Robert Kaplan, as the smallest of pivots on which swing all the parts. In the police use of biometrics and surveillance, there is a growing dependency on technology to deliver even basic services. ANPR is a good example. There is now a critical dependency on ANPR capability, which reportedly now has more hits per second than Instagram, yet has no statutory underpinning. And with dependency comes risk. In the future, this dependency can be expected to evolve, not just to include the police technology, but also that of the citizen. The police are increasingly reliant on doorbells and dash cams and GoPros. And in short, the police will be dependent on the aggregated surveillance product of a range of devices and systems. This means the relationship with the citizen needs to adapt. It's probably no longer enough to repeat the policing by consent mantra. We need to be clear how far society supports the use of police technology and in what circumstances, with what qualifications, and reservations. And if we can't do that ourselves, then the only way to address it will be in primary legislation, the ultimate expression of democratic will. So to sum up, in the debate about the police use of technology, I think there are several critical things to remember. A, it's not always about the technology. Voltammetry is probably a good example. It's the same technology that allows green patrol vehicles and tasers. Both exploit the same technological progress, but its application and implication for the citizen are very different. It is about the technology when that technology makes us uncomfortable, either because it engages with something anthropological like our attitude to our face, or when the technology is tainted, for example, because the service provider is also using it to perpetrate human rights atrocities in another jurisdiction whose ethical values differ from our own. And it's bigger than the technology. Commercially, ethical use of technology is possibly a source of differentiation and competitive advantage in some markets at the moment, but it can't remain that way. It may eventually come as standard, but in policing, it has to be standard because of the nature of policing. To quote the European Code of Police Ethics, the condition of a democracy can often be determined just by examining the conduct of its police. Now, that's a very powerful observation, and the conduct of its police will increasingly include the way in which they use technology. What does ethical police technology use look like? Well, I'm not sure, but I think most of us will know unethical use of technology when we see it. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the biggest risk to our traditional model of policing may be their use of technology. And if people withdraw their support for one, they withdraw their support for the other. So our police are fully equipped to use technology ethically. The question will be how we assure ourselves that they are in fact doing so. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Fraser. And thanks Tech UK for hosting this panel on such a kind of topical and important issue. My name is Giles Hurdale. I'm chairing the rest of this session. And I think Fraser's very helpfully kind of framed some of the central issues that we're going to be discussing. Just to remind you, there is an opportunity to ask any questions of the panelists. I'll be introducing them in a moment using the Q&A function, and we'll try and weave those questions into the discussion. But without further ado, we have an excellent set of panelists to kind of wrestle with some of the issues that Fraser's so helpfully framed for us. And you'll be hearing briefly from them before we kind of get into a discussion. So in reverse order of speaking, Dr. Marion Oswald from Northumbria University has great expertise in this field, having worked not just as an academic lawyer looking at information law, but also practically as the chair of West Midlands Police Data Ethics Panel, an advisor to the House of Lords Justice and Home Affairs inquiry around the use of technology, and also now being a board member of CDEI. Dr. Kevin McNish is also got an academic background, having worked both in the UK and the Netherlands. Is now working in industry for Sopra Steria, where he's contributed to a report that was issued very recently on the use of data ethics within policing. I'm sure you'll be hearing more from him about that work. And Lofrid Madzu is the project lead for AI and machine learning at the World Economic Forum. Very interested in frameworks for ethical use and oversight of AI in specific use cases. So Lofrid, can we hear from you first?
Sure. Well, first, thank you very much for having me and for Tech UK for putting this together. I will briefly present the work that I've been doing on facial recognition before extending my fellow panelists. I think the conversation is going to be really interesting. So here's a bit of background for you guys. For over a year now, we've been working on the responsible use of facial recognition in law enforcement for law enforcement investigations, and you can hardly think of more controversial application of facial recognition. So the stakes are really high, even though we can acknowledge the benefits of facial recognition for improving investigations and ultimately bring offenders to justice, we need to understand the challenges that comes with that use case regarding the potential adverse impacts on minorities or more broadly human rights abuses. So to work around this, we started working with the UN agency in ICRI, the United Nations Center for Research on Crime, with the Police of the Netherlands, but also with Interpol and the World Economic Forum. That was a core community, and we have a larger community. We started by listing some use cases and how actually law enforcement is using facial recognition or could be using it in the EU, having the example of the Netherlands more specifically. The first thing that was really, really important for us is to get really close to what's going on the ground, moving away from the speculative use to look at what actually is going on and what law enforcement agencies are trying to achieve. That was really, really critical. So in the first part of our work in our published white paper, you will find specific use cases and how they actually, how it plays out on the ground. The second element was to identify what are the risks related to these different use cases. And we have identified 9 categories of risk, obviously from the privacy, but also from the training of face examiners. That's something often underappreciated. All of us think that we are really good at recognizing someone's face, but it actually comes with training and some actually high level of skills. And we spend a lot of time thinking about what should be the training of someone who's so consequential in the use of facial recognition. We also have provisions on the testing of these algorithms and the performance, critical as we know that they tend to perform differently across demographics based on some academic studies in the US. So it's really critical to get a sense how they perform on live condition. That's the first, I would say, part of the governance framework. So a set of principles for actions, 9 of them. The white paper is available online, and you could see all the categories of risks, and this is tied to the use cases that were identified. Again, it's a really pilot-based, use case-based approach. The second part of the framework, equally important, is the assessment questionnaire. So we've designed a set of questions, very detailed questions for law enforcement agencies using FRT to make sure that they comply with the principles for action that have this human rights, strong human rights angle. And this work is going to be tested starting in January by the Police of the Netherlands, but also the Swedish Police Authority, and we have other law enforcement agencies who have reached out. It's not official yet, but watch out for early January. You will have some news. So just to close up on this, it's a very, very important topic, but it's really important that we get first evidence on how the technology is going to be used or is being used, what are the risks linked to these specific use cases, and ultimately evidence on what is a robust governance framework. And that's the whole ambition of that project. Back to you, Jill, sorry.
Thank you very much, Alfred. Lots to pack in there, and very interesting to see your focus on specific practical use cases in the European context. Kevin, can I hand over to you now?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Giles. Yes. So as you said, I'm digital ethics consultant with Sopra Steria, prior to which I was an academic philosopher at Leeds and Twente for 12 years, where I was working on ethics of surveillance, privacy and automation issues. And you very kindly mentioned the Sopra Steria report, which was published yesterday following some extensive stakeholder engagement with a key number of police forces, just looking at how they engage with ethics and technology. And I think it's very key, picking up on Giles's point and some things that Lofred has said as well, that obviously the police need to use technology to fulfill the ethical function they already have in society of protecting the public and keeping the peace. But it's key that to do that, they need to use the technology ethically. And so what we were looking at in this report was to see what the state of play is, if you like, among several of the police forces in England and Wales, and where they currently stand. So we came out with some key things, such as the importance of openness and engagement with the public in order to develop public trust. I don't think that's anything particularly new. We've seen that in a lot of areas of technology, that public trust requires transparency, but also effective and ethical data sharing, both between forces and non-police forces, other state institutions. For instance, even in the last few weeks, we keep seeing cases where either data is shared inappropriately or where data is not being shared where it should be being shared. And so I think some clear help and guidance would be good on that front, and also some good tools in order to help that happen. Going back to Loffred's point about facial recognition, issues about bias that are constantly being suffered, and that's clearly one of the most contentious areas with facial recognition, but also others as well. Privacy concerns around body cams are another consideration there. I think as well, we kind of felt that, and this may be pushing back a little bit on something that Fraser said, that we kind of felt that at the moment there is a fairly limited digital ethics capability among the forces. I think that West Midlands is one of the only, if not the only, force that has a dedicated digital ethics, or sorry, data ethics committee, which Marion heads. And I think that's fantastic. And there are some national level guidelines coming out. But what we found in the research was there's a need for more specific and clearer guidance coming out regarding technology and what to do. So I think to sum that up, I think it's crucial that police use of technology does develop. They can't do nothing because crime isn't sitting around doing nothing. The doing nothing option sort of just blinds ourselves to the fact that the rest of the world is moving on. But we've got to move forward in an ethical way that just doesn't accept sort of a bland sales patter saying, no, our equipment is not biased. Of course, everyone's going to say that. And of course, under the right laboratory conditions, it won't be. But I think we need to dig into that and be critical and examine the technology in order to see that it is used effectively. And it's through that we're going to get to maintain the public trust. And again, coming back to something Giles said, the policing by consent model, of which we're traditionally very proud of in this country. But in order to keep that, we have to keep public trust, and that means using the technology correctly.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Marion.
Thanks, Giles, and really appreciate the opportunity to give some personal views on this really important topic. As I think Fraser's opening remarks emphasised, I think it's really important to bear in mind that the technical, legal and operational ethical aspects are really closely interconnected in the area of policing. We need to know what the output of technology means in the context of the operational decision being taken. And obviously in policing, there's a high severity of many operational decisions, including arrest, stop and search, covert surveillance and interventions aimed at rehabilitation and supporting people away from crime. So as I think both Loffred and Kevin were emphasising, it's crucial that we assess how tech will be used in practice. So in order to equip police forces to use tech ethically, I propose a three-pillar approach. Law, as you might expect from a lawyer. We don't have a legal vacuum, although we might sometimes get that impression, but we do need clear guidance and policy for the policing context. So Loffred's white paper, I think, is really an important step in respect of facial recognition in law enforcement. We need scientific standards written with policing context in mind to help police forces judge whether the tech is any good or not. And that's an area highlighted in CDEI's AI assurance roadmap that's been launched today. And then we need ethical standards linked to an individual's personal responsibility. For example, also the CDEI's decision-making toolkit that's being developed alongside Police Scotland. But I think crucially, we need people who understand and are committed to the underlying values that the law and the ethical standards represent and are prepared to be thoughtful, engage in professional development, and are empowered to constructively challenge the development and deployment of tech and AI. And underpinning those three pillars, we need independent regulation, and alongside that, ongoing scrutiny and advice. And that's where the West Midlands PCC and West Midlands Police Data Ethics Committee comes in. As Kevin said, the first of its kind within UK policing. There are a small number of other forces now that are also setting up specific data ethics committees along the same lines. And this committee brings together many voices and areas of expertise in one forum in order to review data and tech projects on a rolling basis. It can recommend, and it has recommended, the rethinking or even stopping of tech projects, and perhaps more positively, it's contributed to building confidence in projects, in the many projects that move forward. However, there are 43 plus police forces in England and Wales, and we're yet to see a national consistent approach. So I would certainly agree that a national model based on this prototype could contribute to giving further assurance around trustworthy policing tech, combined with appropriate and robust regulation and enforcement. I'd just like to make a final comment about how perhaps it's all too easy to forget that there are real people affected by this debate. And I'm sure we've all been really shocked and saddened by the terrible case of Arthur Labinia Hughes, killed last year by his stepmother and father. A national inquiry has been announced. Will hopefully look into what information about the family was shared and used and whether more could have been done. I don't know if any algorithms were involved in the decisions made in this case. However, many algorithms within policing and other public services are focused on risk assessment and on triaging and prioritizing offenders and potential victims. So maybe we should always be asking ourselves if the use of new technology will help us protect people like Arthur, or whether moving to an algorithmic approach risks missing relevant details or factors, or missing circumstances where there's just not enough information to make an algorithmic informed decision, or whether introducing tech will change ways of working that could affect how legal responsibilities are being fulfilled, and whether any of those things mean that people like Arthur might fall through the cracks. And in my view, that should be the ultimate ethical test. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much indeed to all the panelists for setting up this conversation. So many kind of important issues that flow from that. And if I can kind of start off by perhaps asking a question. All the panelists, I think, have referred to the importance of transparency and independent oversight in building public trust. There's inherently a kind of tension here because by necessity, quite a lot of policing activity isn't very transparent. The investigation of crime is often needs to not be transparent, certainly not to the people being investigated. So how do you manage that kind of tension between the need for public trust and transparency and operational security concerns? Kevin, can I invite you to come in there?
It's a really interesting question, and one that comes up a lot in the ethics of surveillance debate as well. And I think there are kind of two approaches that we could think about here. One is prior, because I mean, you made the point very well that clearly the people who are under investigation cannot know, and you're not about to bring them into the discussion. So there are two aspects. One is the prior aspect of saying, well, let's investigate the technology that's being used. Let's investigate the processes that are being used. And that can be done without too much harm. I suppose there is a potential for somebody to game the system if they knew enough about it, if you have some predictive policing software, which thankfully I don't think we're talking about yet. That people could learn to game the system in those cases. But broadly speaking, I think you can have informed, helpful public discussion there. And then you can have a post-event, sort of post hoc review, lessons learned, audit of what happened and what went on. So I think you can operate with a level of transparency around that without endangering investigations themselves.
Thank you. Lofred, I think you were next.
Sure. So on that very, very important question, I think one way to approach it is to move away from a specific investigation and ask ourselves, what are the overall like transparency and accountability mechanism that needs to be in place even before deploying the technology? At the moment, in most jurisdictions, one of the issues is that you don't have a standardized training for face examiners or any agents using the technology. And I think it's really important to say, well, what's the point? What's the relationship with transparency and accountability? Well, that's part of it. If something goes wrong, we need to know who are involved, what kind of training they've been through, what kind of decisions they made, and how, to what extent these decisions seem sensible, really, in regards to their training and what they were expecting to do. And this has to be pretty clear, pretty standardized. That's one element. The second element is the testing of the algorithms themselves. I'm thinking about facial recognition specifically. One thing I discovered as well is that you have quite a reliable assessment done at the laboratory level, thinking about the NIST studies, but you have virtually nothing for algorithms deployed in live conditions. It's something completely different, making this assessment comparison in the laboratory or trying to find out what's the performance level of that system in a London tube station at 8 p.m. and someone running into the tube, right? So these are the really practical elements that needs to be, I think, more considered. And one proposal is having a center of excellence around these key things: training of, law enforcement agents using facial recognition, and also testing on field conditions, the performance of the system. And this information should be available to competent authorities, but also to the public at large. So that's my 2 points on this.
Thank you very much, Lofred. Fraser, I'm sure this is an issue that you're very familiar with.
Oh, thank you. I mean, very, very specifically from my own statutory responsibilities, I think it's important to note a distinction between regulation, which provides some degree of assurance and transparency, and the function that I currently perform, or functions as biometrics commissioner for the retention and use of biometrics by the police and some partners. And the way in which my role works is interesting, because it's not a regulator, and therefore the government's consultation on, could the ICO step in and cover this off has been responded to by myself and others to say, well, no, because it isn't a regulatory function. But in terms of what I do, if you look at the national security determinations, which are it's a power for chief officers to retain the biometrics of individuals who, while never having been convicted of an offence, are nevertheless in their view of such a threat to national security that those biometrics ought to be retained. It is a highly invasive, in that respect, and enduring interference with the right to private home family life. It is necessarily undertaken in secret strap conditions. And the individuals who are affected by it, of course, have no sight of being involved in it, let alone any opportunity to make representations or to raise a challenge. So the only thing between the decision makers and users of that technology and legal framework and the public is me, because I see every aspect of it, including the entire intelligence picture, aggregated from different parts of the sectors. And have the statutory obligation to look at the way in which the thought process in arriving at that decision has been followed, and with an ultimate power, and it is an IT power, because it's run by the software, to hit a kill button and the material is destroyed. And in terms of the number of occasions on which that's been used, I have to report to Parliament. I just reported last week to Parliament on how that has worked since I've been post how many of these I have seen and the extent to which it's worked. And also, I think very importantly, given the period that we're still in with the global pandemic, the impact of a temporary suspension of the requirements to pass those national security determinations in light of the pandemic. So again, I've had to report and have reported back to Parliament on the extent to which the police have used that temporary period of suspension, where even the safeguards around this have been necessarily paused. And any views that I may have, having visited CT policing and SO15 and the other bodies involved in that decision-making process. So it's possibly unique, but it is also possibly expandable and applicable to other areas of deeply intrusive surveillance practice, should we find ourselves there. And it's quite an interesting example to look at.
Thank you very much. And Marion, I'm conscious that you and your committee have looked at this very issue in terms of operational deployment of technology in the West Midlands context. Are there any particular lessons from that about how to manage this process?
Yeah, I mean, it's really the transparency question really brings in all sorts of sub questions, because I suppose ultimately you have to decide what the purpose of transparency is. As Fraser's comments, I think, emphasize that process is about transparency for challenge and regulation, but there are other purposes of transparency. For example, transparency to give information to the world about what's going on, as I suppose the West Midlands Committee does to a certain extent by publishing its minutes transparently, and potentially the new algorithmic transparency standard that's recently been published by the Cabinet Office and CDI is intended to do as well. But I think we're still we don't know how far that might apply to policing algorithms and how much detail could be included in that process. Certainly, it's something that we're conscious of within the committee, that there may be projects that come to the committee where some of the operational details or the details around the technical aspects of the algorithm and what it takes into account might expose sensitive tradecraft, either police tradecraft or criminal tradecraft that you don't want to be in the world. But then that you do have a process within that committee of assuring that it's being reviewed by somebody, even though the details can't be exposed. But then I think that there is a really important part of transparency that we often overlook, which is transparency to the user, to the police officer user of the technology. How do they know what they need to know about that technology, what it's taking into account, what the outputs actually mean, what uncertainties there are about those outputs, what it's not doing. And I think that is equally, if not more important than the other aspects of transparency that we've been talking about.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. There's a follow-on question from the remarks that I think all the panelists have made, and I'm very conscious as the chair of this panel that neither myself or any of the panelists are actually serving police officers, so we're kind of opining about police use of technology without actually being the end user. But I do think this point around the human technology interface is particularly important in the policing context, not least because of obviously there are legal safeguards around automated decision making, which require humans to be in the loop, certainly with consequential decisions around of the sort that police officers are frequently having to make. But this issue around the user, whether that's an operational frontline user out on the street or in a police station, or indeed a more senior decision maker is having to make decisions based on information that's being collected, how they are being exposed to that information and are equipped to make those decisions is, I think, a really interesting issue. So I just wondered to what extent the panel had any views or examples about sort of how there might be some areas of potential good practice that could be built upon. Marion.
Thanks. I absolutely agree. I think that the user interface is actually often fundamental to ensuring that the police understand what it is that the technology is doing, and importantly what it's not doing. And I've seen some good examples of user interfaces that do provide some, provide that form of information to the police user, so they are able to see how the recommendation or the output of the tool has actually been generated, what information has been taken into account, so that they could potentially take a view on whether it's relevant to the decision that they need to take. But there are other examples of other interfaces that don't do that well at all. So I agree that it's a real fundamental area that needs to be looked at very carefully. But in order to do that, there needs to be much better understanding of what context these tools are going to be introduced into, what is the legal test you're having to satisfy by making the decision, and therefore, is this tool actually helping you answer the right question or not?
Absolutely. Fraser, I think you were next.
Thank you. Yes, building on from Marion's point there, one of the things that has been really clear to me in visiting police forces and in particularly the sort of biometrics teams and on occasion the custody teams is the importance of the practitioners, if you like, understanding the relative contribution that this technology and this activity makes to the whole value chain, if you like, of largely the criminal justice process. So as simple as realizing that if the technology that is researched and tested and tried out and then procured and monitored and installed isn't used in the way in which it was intended, then the contribution that it makes to that overall value chain will be diluted or even totally frustrated. There are some very basic things, one of which I've mentioned in the annual report, went to Parliament last week, that the biggest source of rejection and then the requirement for resampling in biometrics in the police is the failure to seal the bag. And when I've raised this with some practitioners, we realize it is easier, in fact, in some ways, than sealing the bag with your toothbrush in it before you get on an airplane. This is not high tech. But actually, if you get that one small low tech part of it wrong, everything else that follows can't. It just has to be done again. When we're looking at mobile enrollment of fingerprints, for example, and other areas where the technology is taking the tech to the scene in criminal investigation rather than the scene coming to the technology, that's going to become even more important to understand that it's a bit like the integrity of the chain of evidence. If one bit of it is contaminated or compromised, then the entire thing is. And I think that can often be missed in the rush to the exciting bits. But actually, if it's the basic application of it that defeats the very best minds of the people who put it together, then it will be very frustrating because it's the easiest bit to get right.
No, absolutely, and you make a very powerful point around the fact that there's an evidential integrity point here, which ultimately all of this material can end up within the criminal justice system and has the duties within that process around following lines of evidence, whether those point towards or away from the suspect. We've already seen how digital evidence has posed some challenges in that regard, and I suspect those will become more acute. Lofred, you've already alluded to the training of humans within the facial recognition chain. So perhaps,
yeah. So again, I think it's one of the most important elements in our discussion in biometric, but mostly in AI and policing, thinking that at the end of the day, it's always a human agent that makes the final call. So the question is really about, in that interaction with the system, to avoiding technology complacency is, to what extent that agent can rely to the system. He has to understand the limitations of the system, its capabilities, in and out, and how it plays, in the operational context to make that final call. So as part of our work, we spend a lot of time actually explaining how the face examiner's process works with the police of the Netherlands. It's actually like cross examination. So you have two face examiners looking at this after the candidate list has been provided by the technologies. So one misconception that goes around is from thinking that the system, like in movies, tells that's Kevin. It never does this, actually. What it does, it gives you like a short list of, statistically like relevant candidates in that short list, and ultimately you have face examiners making the final call. On that very elements of training that I would like to insist on is, it's really, really important to give that room, enable that room to the human agent to make that decision. Why I'm saying this is, in such a controversial space, there's also a very sensible, psychological, I would say, behavior that we observe in face examiners, a tendency to deflect on the technology and going for what is being recommended, and being suspicious if it departs from whatever recommendations. And I think it's really, really important, because the truth is it's not standardized yet. So I go back on the standardization. What do we expect really from the agents in the systems? What are the capabilities of the systems? Also, how do you really practically, what information you give to the agent as he uses the system, so he really understands what he can get out of it and where the technology stops. And all this standardization in training and assessment and available information to agents in operational conditions, at least what I've seen is not really in place at the moment for face recognition. So there's a lot of work to do around that.
Absolutely. No, thank you very much, Lofred. Kevin, over to you. And I'm conscious that just to give an alert to the panel, we've got about 3 minutes left. So after Kevin's said something, we'll need to get into closing remarks. So think about the one point you'd like to make before we finish.
Okay, thank you, Giles, and I'll try and keep my response brief then. So my feeling was on 2 points. One is the need for closing any loop or closing any gaps that there may be between vendors, procurement and commissioning, and officers on the ground. Certainly in our report, we found that wasn't always as smooth as it should be, and the potential to critically engage with technology before it was purchased, before it was put into use, just wasn't there. The second concern, I think, ties in with a point Fraser raised earlier about the speed of development and deployment, putting pressure on forces, needing to get stuff through the door and out into the field quickly, particularly if that's coupled with staffing pressures, which I won't say which country this took place in, that it wasn't the UK, but I know of one force that brought in predictive policing software for a major city and had one person running the software. And now one person is not able to critically evaluate the capacities of that software to run effectively, still less look at any discriminatory aspects that it might be having. And of course, with predictive software, that's exactly the issue. So I think there are a couple of things there. The main thing that I would want to push on is for the ability for officers in the field to be able to critically engage with the technology that they use and feed that back. And I think the developers would want that as well, ultimately. Otherwise, there's a danger that we can sell stuff that we can say, well, this will do all things to all people, only to find out that actually it really doesn't.
Thank you very much. Just conscious we have about a minute left. So can I invite each of the panelists to just say one thing they'd like to see happen in this space in the next 12 months? Lofred, you've got your hand up. I don't know if it's a new or old hand, but I'll ask you first.
Sorry, it was a old one. Sorry, guys. Well, more cooperation, more events like this, more testing and more training. I keep going back. These are my two mantra. We need to test these systems. We need to train agents using them. That's it.
Okay. Thank you so much. Marion?
As you might expect, I'd like to see more progress on having a national approach to ethical oversight, but also thought given to, what decisions are we trying to make with technology, and does that technology actually help us make those decisions better?
Thank you. Fraser?
Now, I'd like us to reflect the importance of ethical use in all other elements of the technology ecosystem, not just the new bits, and to ask what relative weight is given to the ethical considerations when compared to, for example, budget. So next time you watch a presentation on a surveillance project, see how far into the slide deck it is before ethics appears.
And Kevin, any final thoughts?
Oh, thank you. I would just echo what everybody has said in those last few thoughts. I think ethics needs to permeate the force from the top down. It needs to be there throughout the force and all forces, and so it's fully permeated. But also, picking up on Marion's point, a national approach to benchmarking, auditing and reporting on technology would help the vendors, it would help the police, and it would give us all somewhere where we can turn to a consistent point of authority to say, okay, this is what good looks like.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much to all the panelists for your really thoughtful and insightful remarks. This is a panel that we could have run for a considerable longer period than this, but time has defeated us. We will certainly pick some of these issues up, and I'm sure this won't be the last time that Tech UK raises this subject within this forum. Thank you.